Welcome to the sixth dialogue of the War and the World, the ISPI program where we have invited prominent speakers to help us look around the corner and see what the near future holds for the global politics, economics and other relevant fields. Today I have the great pleasure to talk about the future of humanitarian aid with Peter Maurer, President of the International Committee of the Red Cross. Thank you, President Maurer, for being with us today. Very kind and generous of you. I always start this dialogue, President Maurer, with a comment on what's going on right now. I mean, the conflict. Let me have two questions. Were you expecting this conflict? And what is your take so far on the conflict?
Well, we were not expecting the conflict in a way it unfolded and escalated over the last couple of weeks. At the same time, we have been for 8 years already with a very substantive humanitarian operation in Ukraine on both sides of the contact line. And so, in a sense, we were in that conflict for a much longer time than the international community even recognized that this was a conflict and that serious things were happening around the contact line in Ukraine. But the form and format, the emanation, the escalation that we have seen over the last couple of weeks was certainly a surprise to us. We didn't count on it. And of course, we then also very frankly struggled to adapt our operation to this huge impact of military operation on the civilian population. What is, of course, always particularly mind-boggling is to see the enormous amount of suffering that we have accumulated over the last 6 weeks. And this is, of course, something which we will not get easy out of it. What strikes me most at the present moment is also that the cost of conflict is always underestimated when conflict escalate or start. Also, the duration of a conflict is underestimated. I always have those leaders of countries who are in conflict and who tell me at the beginning that it will be over in a week or in 2 weeks, and it is never over in 2 weeks. And most of the time, we are still there 10 years after or 20 years after. And so the last point maybe is really also to recognize that in our mandate, as you know, we are not only an assistance organization. We care about the respect of international humanitarian law and principles, which is designed to limit the impact of warfare. And we are particularly struck by the number of violations in form of impact on the civilian populations that we are seeing.
Thank you. While the European Union has mostly focused on people leaving the country, 4 million, more than that, an estimated 7 million people have now been displaced inside Ukraine, almost half of them children. The International Red Cross has been active in the country since day one of the invasion. Actually, it was there even before, as you mentioned. What's your assessment of the situation on the field?
Well, our assessment is indeed that almost by the day, the needs within the country get more acute. Many people, as long as the military operations persist, and you know that despite the reconfiguration of the conflict in the last week, there is still a lot of military activities ongoing. There is the fear of further escalation ongoing, and this has almost preventive displacement as a consequence. And therefore, the needs are not only growing because of the direct impact of the war along the front lines, but also because of the psychological impact on displacement. And as you know, this has been, since the Second World War, probably the largest displacement crisis on the European continent. If we calculate those who are formerly refugees going out of the country and the internally displaced together. This is a huge humanitarian crisis at which we are looking at the present moment. And therefore also the struggle together with, in particular, the Ukrainian authorities, but also the respective authorities on the other side of the front line to mount a humanitarian operation which assists and protects adequately. This is a big problem given the level of escalation.
More than, as I mentioned, more than 4.5 million Ukrainians have left their country, so they are refugees. How do you rate the European Union reaction to this unprecedented humanitarian crisis?
Well, I must say I have been impressed not only by institutionally the response of the European Union, but also by European societies who were extremely welcoming and in hosting and assisting those who came out of the country. And I have always said over the last couple of weeks that this should be the standard over which we also hope to see applied towards other important refugee movements around the world. I think it's great to see the level of engagement. It would also be great to see similar or same levels of engagement when displacements are happening in other parts of the world.
That's a good point. You have recently been both to Moscow and Kiev. Let me ask you, President Maurer, do you see any hope for a truce in the short term from your experience?
Well, one side is, do we see any hope in a truce? And truces are very much political decisions, political concepts. And in that sense, it's difficult for me whether I see hope or not hope. This depends a lot on the contacts between the parties, on the facilitation of truce between the parties. And you know that first and foremost, the facilitation by Turkey in Istanbul is, I think, the biggest hope everybody has in the world, that peace talks or truce talks are advancing. What I think in our line of work, which is really the respect for international humanitarian law as long as the conflict persists and also beyond, we do see hope in the quality of dialogue that we entertain with Russia as well as Ukraine to make progress on such important issues as prisoners of war, civilian detainees, on the management of dead bodies, on other core areas of international humanitarian law. Progress will always be slow, will always be difficult, but I do see positive engagements by the government of Ukraine, but also the Russian government with us in order to hopefully mitigate a little bit on those very critical issues of the Geneva Conventions, the suffering that we are experiencing and Ukrainians are experiencing.
We have been, over the last 2-3 weeks, gradually uncovering atrocities committed during this conflict, as in many other conflicts, but probably even more. What can we do, looking at the future, to prevent mass atrocities to take place? Where are we wrong? I mean, we keep saying.
From the perspective of the International Committee of the Red Cross, of course, there are two major areas of work preventively. One is definitely that if international humanitarian law, as it was intended and as it is written down in the Geneva Convention and the additional protocol, were respected, we would see a considerable less amount of suffering. So knowing and respecting the law and ensuring that the armed forces know that the ground rules, the rules of procedures, the doctrines, the military doctrines are shaped in a way that protect civilians is the most effective preventive pathway that we would envisage. And then there is a second level which we have focused more over the last couple of years. It's looking at, I would almost say, the software of behavior of belligerents. How do we get to those breakdowns of civility in war? And how do we ensure that those who are engaged in military operations respect restraint against civilians, respect the international law? That's a behavioral science issue and not only a legal issue. And I think those two pathways at the present moment are priorities for ICRC to work in order to prevent that things are happening and that we are coming again to battlefields which look like the ones we have uncovered and seen over the last couple of weeks.
But to this respect, do you think that international condemnations can help force parties in conflict to cease indiscriminate attacks on civilians and the perpetration of grave breaches of the Geneva Convention? Or
well, it may have a positive impact on at certain moments and in certain circumstances. But you know that from an institutional perspective, again, it's not what, as a priority, the ICRC pursues. We have consistently held the opinion that in our line of work, first and foremost, we need to ensure confidential dialogue, and through confidential dialogue contribute to trust building. Because at the end of the day, what is it when norms fail? It's also a failure of minimal trust between belligerents. The whole concept of respect builds on the minimal respect of norms by both sides of belligerents, and if we don't have it, then we have a breakdown of trust. Trust is not easily established in the public space, but trust is something which is established in slow motion progress that is very much the methodology that ICRC has applied over the last 160 years. I don't want to speak negatively about public condemnation. Other organizations have other mandates, have other profiles, have other ideas, but I wanted to be clear what our course of action in priority is.
And it's consistent to your mandate. There's been some disinformation during the rounds online about the relationship between the International Red Cross and the Russian Red Cross. Can you please tell us what the situation on the ground is? How do you cooperate with the Russian Red Cross, and what is your role in assisting the over 400,000 Ukrainians that arrived in Russia since the conflict started?
Well, from ICRC sides, as with any national society in a theater of conflict in which we operate, the respective Red Cross society, be it the Ukrainian Red Cross or the Russian Red Cross, are privileged partners of ours in the respective territories of operation, and we normally support them to support the respective populations in their mandate. And of course, as in every family, there is sometimes tension on what principled humanitarianism is, and we try to solve those tensions by having dialogue with the respective national society. But with regard to the Russian Red Cross, this situation is not fundamentally different. They are the first line responders for those who come from Ukraine into Russia. ICRC tries to ensure that principles, humanitarianism, is respected by the Russian Red Cross in its assistance operation, and we uphold those principles within the movement. If we see areas of concern, we try to sort them out through dialogue. And then, of course, it is also one of the importance of ICRC being present on our own, and not only by supporting national societies, but also on our own, to have our own judgment what good humanitarianism in a certain context is.
President Maurer, thank you very much indeed, and good luck for your very important and relevant work. It was a pleasure to have you with us.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate the opportunity, and I wish you the best.